Okay, we're going to start now, right on time, or almost on time. Thank you all for coming. My name is Tom Morgan. I'm the director of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at the College of St. Scholastica, where we do a lecture series very much like this one every year. This is the last lecture for this year. Did we save the best for last? This is the fifth in the series. The topic is listening to voices of America. And this lecture is sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice at the College of St. Scholastica and funded in part by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Evera Foundation, and by Mary C. Van Evera in memory of William Van Evera, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Royal D. Alworth Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth, Reader Weekly of Duluth, and numerous other private donors. Thank you from me and on behalf of the college for your support of this series. You make it happen. If you're interested in being on our mailing list and you're not already, you can do that out in the lobby, documents to sign, and you can receive information through the post office about upcoming programs, and there's also a place to be on our email list. So I encourage you to do that. Also in the lobby is a table staffed by Veterans for Peace. So after the lecture, you're invited to come and take a look at that as well. A couple of other things to promote. These are not sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice, but they are in this building, they're in this auditorium, and so I wanted to promote them. The first event is a week from today, Thursday, April 6th. This is sponsored by the Francis X. Shea Memorial Lecture Fund here at the college, and also sponsored by the Brigham Program in Catholic Studies and the School of Arts and Letters. And the program is noted American poet Dr. Coleman Banks, and he will read selections of poetry by the 13th century Persian mystic Rumi, and accompanied with exotic instruments and commentary. That's a week from tonight in this auditorium. And then toward the end of the month, April 20th to be specific, also on a Thursday, another program sponsored by the Brigham Program in Catholic Studies will feature Dr. Wendy M. Wright, professor of theology at Creighton University, will speak about the Catholic imagination in a sacramental world. So I draw your attention to that. On the screen to your left, we are displaying the text of tonight's lectures through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to the technology. Nevertheless, research indicates that many viewers benefit from captioning, including those with hearing loss, of course. A special thanks to the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this inclusive service possible tonight. You will notice there's a very impressive looking woman whose picture is behind me, and her name is Martha Alworth. And this lecture is officially the Martha Alworth Memorial Lecture. Every year we honor her memory and her name, and she's done so much for the college and for this community. At this point, I would like to invite my colleague from UMD, the director of the Royal D. Alworth Jr. Institute for International Studies at UMD, Cindy Christian, and she has a few reflections of Martha.
Thank you, everyone. It's a real honor for me to be asked to talk about Martha a little bit. I met Martha Alworth in 1993 when I first moved to the area. She was a member of a UN association group that I joined at that time, and it was during our interactions group that I learned about Martha's interest and passion in issues of international peace and justice, their opposition to the Vietnam War, which we talked about, her support for Paul Wellstone, her opposition to the Iraq War, and I would really love to hear what she'd have to say right now. That would be fascinating. I loved her liveliness, the bright colors she wore, her large frame glasses, her gorgeous white hair, as you can see, and her silver Mustang. I thought it was white, but I was corrected. I'm misremembering that. I also found her to be very modest in her assessment of what she had done for this community in terms of international education. She did not want to be honored by the UN group, although we tried a few times to do that. When I began working for the Royal D. Alworth Junior Institute at UMD, she was determined that her name would not join her husband's in recognition there. And I'm not sure how she would feel about a memorial in her honor or the fact that we call our Brownback series at UMD the Martha B. Alworth International Brownback Series. Her family would probably know more about that, but I hope she would be pleased. Over the years working for the Alworth Institute, I was most impressed by two of her characteristics. First, her intellectual curiosity. She was always in the front row at lectures at UMD, the first to ask a question. Her extensive travels around the world led to fascinating conversations with whoever was visiting at the time. Her travels were also the source of one of the funniest exchanges I had with Martha. Several of us were having dinner with a speaker from Bolivia at Zeitgeist in the back room up on the second floor. Some of you probably know where that is. When we got there, Martha was looking out the window with her son Royal and looking at a park that's probably sort of over the highway towards the lake walk. I'm not exactly sure which. But she'd never seen it before, and Royal was explaining to her where it was, what it was. So we sat down and we were talking, and I asked her if she'd ever been to Bolivia. And then I said, oh, what a silly question. You've been everywhere. And she looked out the window and pointed, she goes, well, I've never been there. She was very special to my family as well. In 1999, she visited my husband, Haji Dokanchi's home of Iran. He arranged for his sister, Farah, and an English-speaking friend to show her around Tehran and give her a more personal experience. Before she left, she insisted on meeting my daughter, who was under a year old at the time. When she returned, she made a point of telling us that she had said to my husband's family, I reassured them, she has more hair than you do. He's very bald. When my daughter was born, she gave her a wonderful picture book, my favorite, On the Day You Were Born by Deborah Fraser. It is a celebration of the daily natural phenomenon of the earth and a welcome to the new baby. I now give this book to every new baby I meet or know, and I think of Martha every time. I think it's very fitting that Karen Diver is giving this lecture in honor of Martha's spirit and passion. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, for those thoughts. Back to business now, a couple of other housekeeping issues. After the lecture, we, of course, will have an opportunity for question and answer. Come to the microphones right here and get in line and ask your questions, and our speaker will recognize you in turn. I ask you community people to hang back a little bit and let the students go first. We like to give them a chance to ask questions, of course, and we don't want them to be crowded out, so you'll help me with that, I'm sure. One of the things we do here all the time, every lecture, is we have another gathering in a few days after the lecture. We call it Talk Back, where we can process what we've heard and talk about it and just help us understand it better. The two people who will be facilitating the talkback conversation are highly qualified, know a lot about Indian culture, Tad Johnson and Christina Woods. You all should have had this flyer put in your hands as you came into the auditorium, so you'll know where the talkback is. It's on Tuesday, well, I'm reading it to you, Tuesday at the Damiano Center at 7 p.m. So you're all invited to come to that and talk about what we're going to hear tonight. One last just reminder, if you have cell phones or other devices, please turn them off so we can all be attentive to what we hear. Our speaker this evening is currently serving as faculty at the University of Minnesota Duluth in the Masters of Tribal Administration and Governance program in the Department of Indian Studies. She's just returned to the Northland, however, as many of you know, from Washington, D.C., where she was Special Assistant to the President for Native American Affairs. As part of the Domestic Policy Council, Ms. Diver assisted with interagency efforts, policy, and regulatory changes to benefit 567 Native American tribes. She had that job from November 2015 until the end of the Obama administration in January. Before that, she was the chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa from 2007 to 2015. This is an elective position, and in that capacity, she was both chair of the tribal government and CEO of the reservation's corporate boards. The Fond du Lac Reservation is the second largest employer in northern Minnesota with more than 2,200 employees. She also has served as vice president of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe, a tribal governing body comprised of 6 bands, and she chaired its finance corporation. Ms. Diver also served on the Board of Trustees for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, was Director of Special Projects for the Fond du Lac Band, and for 11 years was the Executive Director of the YWCA here in Duluth. Ms. Diver attended Harvard as a 2002 Bush Foundation Leadership Fellow. She has extensive board experience in the nonprofit sector, including 6 years on the boards of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, serving 2 terms as chair of each of those boards. She was a founding member of the American Indian Community Housing Organization, the Duluth Community Action Program, Duluth Family Services Collaborative, and the Duluth Human Rights Commission. She was an appointee of President Obama to the State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resiliency, and she co-chaired its Natural Resources Committee. She has a bachelor's degree in economics from UMD and a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And she enjoys gardening and antiquing. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Karen Diver.
It's a little bit of a plot. If the bio gets long enough, the speech gets shorter. It's a little kind of boring, but thank you. Thank you for your patience. I, too, am honored to be here tonight as a Martha Alworth memorial event. I remember her fondly from my YWCA days, and she was a bit of a shero at the time because she was just so authentic in her convictions and her commitment to social justice. It is absolutely true that our community is better for having her here in it, and if I could be a small part of her legacy this evening, it is absolutely my honor. So thank you to the Alworth family. So yeah, I worked for this guy that worked in this really big house. We want to talk a little bit about what is the state of Native nations, but before that, and I know, have patience, please. I get this every time I end up talking to larger groups about things that affect tribal communities, and I always tell them, well, we have to start backwards a little bit, right? I don't know where all of you are in your knowledge of federal Indian law and history, and for my remarks about what's going on today to make sense, we have to take a bit of a brief foray going backwards. I know for people who think that those Indians should just get over it, that this is going to take a little bit of patience, but this is going to be the why. Why are things they are today? Why are they like that? So it started with treaty making. It actually started before this country was a country. 2 words I want you to keep in mind as I speak are government and political status and race. We can't talk about tribes without making some differentiation around racial issues versus governmental status. The United States government, rather than just overrun Native people, actually chose to make treaties that recognized under international law that they were equal sovereigns. That's interesting. So it went on for a while, 1778 to 1871, nearly 100 years of treaty making. Now, we all know that didn't turn out so well, but it did set a precedent and a base for both the law and for legislation and for the relationship between the federal government and tribal nations. A lot of this was defined by Supreme Court Justice Marshall in the 1830s, where he said quite definitively in a ruling that tribes possess a nationhood status and retain inherent powers of self-governance. Curious. He also said that the federal government has a trust responsibility, a fiduciary and legally enforceable obligation for the U.S. to protect tribal treaty rights, lands, assets, resources, and people. The trust responsibility, as it is known to tribal leaders. Of course, tribes are mentioned as governments and peers in the U.S. Constitution. In case you haven't read that lately, might I suggest that that's going to become more important in coming days, that you familiarize yourself with the Constitution? What? Just saying, people. But yes, tribes are in the Constitution, recognized that they have an interaction with Congress. Congress can regulate relationships with Indian tribes, but it also gives Congress plenary power. Plenary power. The heck is that? Plenary power, it's akin to total power. And it actually influenced federal tribal relations for quite a number of years. The reason why we have the Marshall Trilogy out of the 1830s was the relationship and the treaties and the trust responsibility kept being defined. And so the official status of Indian people and tribes ended up being as wards. And the federal government was to serve as foster parents. It was a part of the grand bargain in the treaties that tribes would give up their rights to broad swaths of the United States government. They would be retained with small homelands. And in return, the price that would be paid was that the U.S. government would take on responsibility for tribal people, for their well-being, their education, their livelihoods, their health, their safety, et cetera, and also for those treaty obligations called treaty rights. It was a part of the bargain. So, several different federal Indian eras. I'll let you guys research that because you're probably like super fascinated right now. Right? This is good stuff, right? So there's about 6 or 7 fairly distinct eras of federal Indian policy. One of them was actually termination, where Congress used its total plenary power to just say, poof, you're not a tribe anymore. There was a couple dozen of them where they just took away their status and they ceased to exist. And they've been clawing their way back, trying to get back their recognition of the federal government. This is a colonial system, though, right? I mean, you have tribal people who have been here on their homelands for eons, waiting for the big brother out in Washington to say that you are truly a people and that you are a tribe, even though you've had a continuous existence for centuries, right? It doesn't get more colonial than that. All of these general phases in federal Indian policy changed greatly during the Civil Rights era. Native people and tribes in particular were unintended beneficiaries. It was like, wow, you know, we are empowering communities of color. We are recognizing that majority institutions have played a role in oppression, and that people of color have not had the same bounty and access to equity as majority populations. So they finally got around to the tribes, and they passed some key legislation during the Civil Rights era, Indian Child Welfare Act, where it shut down the pipeline of stealing our children and putting them into the foster care system and the adoptive system. The Indian Self-Determination Act, where tribes could prove that they can self-govern and could actually take control of their own service delivery back from the federal government. So instead of the feds doing it, sending in police, tribes could do it. Educational system, tribes could do it. They had to prove they had administrative capabilities, but they were able to do it. A whole host of legislation that empowered tribes came out of the Civil Rights era. How'd that work out? Well, not that good. Most things that come from the federal government to tribes did not turn out that well. For one thing, they never gave us the same level of resources that they themselves used to provide those services. It was underfunded at best. But you did see tribes becoming stronger in their capabilities to govern, to manage. And what they did do is, it's actually a very Republican philosophy, right? That the best decisions are made as close to the people who are governed. And tribes did that. Average age of death in the 70s for American Indian person was around 56. It's now in the mid-70s. Tribes run their own health systems now. They prioritize public health education. They manage chronic conditions or try to prevent them. They focus on wellness. And they treat entire families as people and as families, not just as a set of symptoms that has walked through the door and sat on the table today, right? So you're starting to see slow chipping away at those outcomes. But it's a pretty big lift, right? Historical poverty, isolation onto reservations. One could argue that those were just really fancier gulags, right? Maybe not even fancier, to tell you the truth. But isolated. Everything was done in isolation. In some ways, that isolation continues with our own schools, our own colleges, our own service delivery. Why? Because they're safe places. And tribes knew that in order to make a dent in the 250 years of oppression and how it's manifested itself in their communities, it's no wonder why we struggle with alcohol and drug addiction. People self-anesthetize when they're in pain. There's a word for it. It's called historical trauma. And it manifests itself in current trauma, and then the cycles continue. So tribes have put a lot of their efforts into intervention and to prevention and to wellness. But yet the pain continues. And what I generally tell people is tribes have been governing since the 70s or 80s, as the case may be, and it might just take as many years as it took to put us in that condition. It will take us that long probably to get better. It's going to take generations. We celebrate each life individually when it works. Every kid who graduates from high school, everyone who makes it through college, everyone who never tries a drug or drinks alcohol, as well as everyone who has the strength to give it up when it becomes a problem. For every family that stays together, for every dad that can stay in a child's life, for everyone that learns the language and retains their access to their culture and their spirituality and to their traditional ways of life, every one of them is a gift. Every single one of them. So we come up to the Obama era, and you still see tribes struggling. There had been intermittent attention from various presidents into Indian affairs. Ironically enough, the last great president on Indian affairs was Richard Nixon. No tittering? Curious? Why? Sure you are. Nixon took the most land into trust for tribes rebuilding their homelands. During one of the eras, late 1800s, there was a concerted effort to diminish the size of the existing reservations that were promised in the treaties. I'll use Fond du Lac since I'm most familiar with it. A little over 100,000 acres diminished to about 20,000 acres due to corruption and the federal agencies, corporate interests. Does that sound familiar at all either? White Earth, even worse, down to a few thousand acres, I think, out of a much larger reservation. And Richard Nixon took the most land back into trust and restored more homelands. The last good president. Clinton was okay. Do you know what I mean? He made a promise zone and put some money into economic development, but really didn't understand that tribes need some capacity building. Tribes are on a continuum, right? You have some with real high needs, lack of administrative capacity, large land bases, lack of social capital, isolation, and then you have some really high-performing tribes. Mississippi Choctaw, where they're one of the largest employers in their state and have real high capacity, right? So there's a continuum, right? He threw money at Pine Ridge and then just walked away and thought it would work because money fixes everything, right? Didn't really think about technical assistance, training, building partnerships, engaging civil society, etc. The other thing Clinton did was he passed Executive Order 13175, which mandated tribal consultation on a government-to-government basis. So this was good. It was a reminder that through the course of history and through treaty making, the very basis of the relationship with tribes between the federal government was that as peers, government to government. Sure, you had that fiduciary duty, that trust responsibility that came out of the treaties, but that all came about because there was an agreement among sovereigns. It was a good showpiece. Of course, some agencies, maybe they hired a tribal liaison. Some agencies did much better at that than others. A lot of them were the land use organizations and resource use organizations where tribes had homelands that were interacting with federal agencies. But a lot of it was really the intention of the administrators and how they committed they were to the idea of tribal consultation and inclusion. So then Barack Obama, as a candidate, visited Crow Reservation, and he promised not to forget the Native brothers and sisters and to respect their sovereignty. And he made some promises, and he seemed like he meant them. He really did. Tribes and tribal people, Native people, it really resonated with them, a candidate of color. When he spoke about knowing what disparities were, what oppressions were, we felt that we could believe that he actually did understand it and it wasn't lip service. So he gets elected and he is true to his word. At this time, I am the tribal chair at Fond du Lac, and we saw a few things happen. We saw him add a senior level advisor in the White House on Native American affairs. And we saw him commit to a yearly meeting with all 567 tribes, where he would have his cabinet secretaries and senior level leaders, and it would be a check-in. He put out a presidential memoranda reminding everybody of the Clinton executive order that mandated consultation and said that he wanted every agency to have them in writing so that they could be reviewed, updated, and agencies could learn from each other. You quickly saw a fairly robust agenda developing out of the White House under Barack Obama related to Native American affairs and tribal relations. He was as good as his word. You saw senior level advisory committees happening at Health and Human Services. Department of Interior didn't make a budget without running it by their tribal budget committee made up of tribal leaders and representatives. We felt like we were co-managers in our own destiny in many cases. We were partners in fulfilling that fiduciary responsibility, and that balance started to feel like it was shifting, that it wasn't being done to us and then a pat on the head at a meeting and you send us home, but that they were really waiting to make decisions and to develop priorities with tribal leadership. It was fun. What are some significant things that happened during this time? Eloise Cobell. Eloise Cobell had been suing the federal government for, decades. She was from Crow, I believe, and she, when the fiduciary responsibility, one of the things that happened is our reservations are really owned by the federal government on our behalf. right? Indian land. And back in the day, Bureau of Indian Affairs workers would, for example, sell timber. And they were supposed to give that money back to the native people that were considered shareholders of that piece of property. It's called an allotment. Now, there was a study done back in the day by one of the universities that said, on average, the federal government charged 93 cents less than the market would have been worth at that time. So that left 7 cents to go to someone like Eloise Cobell. Eloise Cobell was wondering why her family wasn't benefiting. They had minerals, I believe, and grazing rights or something like that. And so she sued the federal government because they weren't doing their fiduciary responsibility in the management of her family's allotted land. She didn't sue them for the 93 cents. She sued them to figure out where the 7 cents was. Yeah, it's kind of, it's funny, not funny, right? 3 Department of Interior secretaries were held in contempt of court for mismanaging the case and actively undermining discovery. In other words, shredding documents that would have helped the native litigants in the case. Barack Obama settled that case with Eloise Cobell and her class action lawsuit. Unfortunately, it was just after Eloise died, but it did 2 significant things, the settlement of that litigation. It set aside, well, in some cases, there were small settlements for the aggrieved parties, certainly nothing like what they lost, but there were 2 funds set up. One was the land buyback program. So let's use my dad as an example. He's from a family of 12, and his dad was allotted 40 acres. Some of his children predeceased him, and when he died, the 40 acres would go to his heirs. Now, usually it's the remaining heirs in normal probate, but not for tribal people. If you predeceased, it wouldn't be redistributed amongst the living heirs. The deceased heir's children then would become a part of the heirship. My dad had inherited a portion of parcels where he was one of 3,000 heirs to a 40-acre parcel. Now, mind you, they don't do a new survey every time where my dad could say, this square foot is mine. They treat it more like a shareholder of the 40 acres. And they need 51% of all of the heirs to agree to ever do anything with the property, which meant nothing ever happened. I have 2 brothers. I can't agree with them, let alone 3,000. So the land buyback program was buying back these parcels called fractionated parcels, fractionated interests. They would go in, do a market survey, determine what your percentage is, and offer you fair market value. Once they reach 51%, the tribe could use eminent domain and buy out the rest at fair market value, returning that land into productive use for tribes to follow under their own land use, zoning, development, whatever, conservation, whatever tribes want. So far to date, under the Obama administration, the land buyback program has resulted in 1.7 million acres, the equivalent of fractionated parcels coming back into tribal control. Woot woot. I was hoping you'd clap because I think that's cool. Then there's just land into trust. Upon occasion, so we told you about Fond du Lac losing about 80% of its land base after the federal government allowed people to come in and buy it. When Fond du Lac buys back a parcel at market rate within its borders, we have to apply to the federal government, every tribe does, to put it back into reservation status. Before Obama, it took about 9 years. And that got down to about 18 months to 2 years. I mean, it is still a bureaucracy, right? But because you have to do environmental reviews and all this other stuff, paperwork. But land into trust The administration had set a goal for 500,000 acres of land into trust during the Obama administration, and they surpassed that. Over 540,000 acres returned to trust status for tribes within their original homelands. That's awesome. I'm really glad you're clapping, because if I had to pick one thing that is most important to tribes, protecting their remaining homelands and restoring them would be something that tribes would go to the mat for. Whether it's environmental protections, whether it's access to traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering on reservation lands and ceded territory, and the quality of those resources, as well as restoring the original boundaries of their reservations. That's actually more important to us than pretty much, except for our children and our elders, that would be the most important thing to us. 69 long-standing lawsuits were settled by Department of Justice on behalf of the Obama administration. It included 104 tribes. These were everything from land disputes to water rights litigation and sorting out tribes. One town actually stuck a big pipe and went horizontally and sucked out a tribe's aquifer. So there was a lot of litigation, and because of that fiduciary responsibility I talked to in the beginning, that was defined by Justice Marshall, where they have to look out for tribes, their assets, their resources. DOJ had to actually help the tribe settle that, but the tribe had to sue DOJ first, and Department of Interior and some other groups. But then under Obama, the family came together and it got settled. 104 tribes, $3.35 billion in settlements into Indian country. Yeah. You should probably be aware that that's pretty much a drop in the bucket of the value of the original claims. Tribes were never really in it about the money. It was about the duty. It was about the treaties. They weren't out to make a point that they wanted to get rich. What they wanted was the federal government to say that they erred. Right? Okay, Indians, calm down over there. Nah, I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Enjoy it while it lasts, because it's over. All right. We had 11 agencies cooperate to do a tribal treaty rights MOU. So we talked back to that Marshall era where it said, enforceable fiduciary obligation of the U.S. to protect tribal treaty rights, lands, assets, and resources. And for the first time, we had 11 agencies come together and sign a tribal treaty rights MOU where they promised to tribes that they would take into account the implications of their actions, both regulatory and permitting, on tribal treaty rights in homeland areas and ceded territories. That's some good stuff, right? 11 agencies. Whoever thought Native Nation building talks would be all exciting, right? So President Obama and his wife, Michelle, went to Standing Rock for a powwow a few years ago. And they asked the staff to get some young people together. You know, you've seen this throughout their presidency, that they just have a real affinity for young people. And they said, we don't want anybody else there, just me and Michelle, the president said. And he met with about a dozen youth from Standing Rock. And by all accounts, after that, the president and Mrs. Obama were forever changed in terms of how they view their duty and the government's duty to Indian country. They were shaken, they were openly crying, and they were incredibly moved by these children who showed incredible resilience, fortitude, strength, and a commitment to surviving in circumstances that were almost unbelievable to the Obamas, who had both come from some level of adversity of their own. They heard stories of a kid living in his car, but still going to school, of a teenager being the primary caregiver for siblings, and on and on and on, but yet they persevered. When they came back, they got the cabinet together, their cabinet members, and it was the second time President Obama cried, and he said that he couldn't understand why, when reservations were actually microcosms, fairly small areas, considering to being president of the whole United States, why we couldn't make better inroads to give these kids a better chance. And of course, that's simplistic, right? In some ways, because yes, they're a microcosm and they're small, but isolation, generational poverty, violence, all of that historical trauma, lack of infrastructure, racism in surrounding communities, on and on and on. He committed to working with the cabinet members, and they came up with the idea of Generation Indigenous. And it was an extraordinary commitment to Native youth, and every single federal agency, 27 of them, who have a hand in dealing with Native American affairs in their portfolio and tribes, were to commit resources and senior level staff and their secretaries into figuring out ways to provide opportunities, intervention, or otherwise just a focus on Native youth, and to the extent possible, let Native youth drive those encounters. What you saw was an incredible menu of opportunities coming out from federal agencies: STEM education, coding, science camps, internships, scholarships, youth advisory boards, a partnership with Aspen Institute and the Center for Native American Youth to provide regular feedback on to recognize student leaders in their community and lift their voices and highlight them as models. We've seen extensive resources coming for Generation Indigenous, and have built, to the extent possible, a robust set of partners in Indian country with tribes as well as the nonprofit sector. Probably one of the biggest things that came out of the Obama administration to affect youth, I talked in the beginning about the Indian Child Welfare Act. That hadn't been updated through regulation since the 1970s when it was passed. Department of Interior undertook the most robust review of the regulations that came out of the Indian Child Welfare Act and updated them for the very first time last year. Along with that update, it gave out a guidance document to be used by courts, district courts, tribal courts, state and county child protection agencies around how to interpret those. Why is this important? We've obviously seen an increasing polarization in this country around what we consider the right and the left. I mean, this isn't a surprise when I say this, right? You've seen some fairly high-profile cases. If you're a news junkie like I am, then you are aware that there's been some fairly high-profile cases that have hit the national news around foster families and adoption, where one of the biological parents is Native, and the foster families or the adoptive families have taken them up to the state Supreme Court, trying to keep Native children away from their biological parents. Well, those are violations of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Those were systems not doing what they were. Those were colonial systems continuing to empower, through their systems, the ability to steal our children. Updates to ICWA were absolutely necessary. It's going to be a little harder for judges to rule and not follow the Indian Child Welfare Act guidelines when there's explicit guidance that goes ahead and says, we wrote a regulation, but now we're going to explain it to you. Yay. That's good stuff. The other thing we did is there's a system of data collection that comes out of the Department of Health and Human Services, where states are required to report to the federal government. For the first time, we promulgated regulations out of HHS. I'm really happy to be a part of that, these two things, where states now have to report to the federal government and their actual counts of Indian child out-of-home placements. Can't fix it if you don't count it. So those two developments are something I'm quite proud of. So race, political status, right? We're still struggling with all of the outcomes. Those numbers are terrible. So what can we do? Is there something we can do to be a little bit more innovative? One of the things that came out of the Obama administration was a trauma-informed care approach. Multi-agency, crossing lines, where tribes can work with these federal agencies to help self-design kind of multidisciplinary approaches to trauma-informed care. Until we start to understand the pain and provide appropriate interventions that are culturally competent, then we're going to continue to pay the price in prisons, right? Truancies, poverty, opioids. We have to start allowing for some flexibility. We can't heal traumatized communities, multiple issue adults, by having discrete grant programs where you're always putting a Band-Aid on the symptom and not looking at wellness. So between Tawahe, which is self-designed by tribes, and trauma-informed care, we're hoping to empower more through a block grant format, tribes able to put forth a multidisciplinary effort that could include everything from strengthening their tribal courts, to working on youth issues, recidivism, reentry. I was telling a story yesterday, pretty typical in Indian country, and you know, as an elected leader, you're there to build systems, but that doesn't mean that the pain of individuals doesn't weigh on your psyche and your heart sometimes. And I use the story of this young man to kind of illustrate that we can be as wonky as we like around policy and regulation, and we can talk about racism and colonialism and all of these lofty ideals, but when it matters is when it has a real face on it, right? And the story that keeps me up at night is a young man who, unfortunately, he saw his dad commit suicide. Now, there isn't a person among us, regardless of the color, who wouldn't have some really deep trauma over that, right? So this kid grew up and he actually needed children's mental health services. And Fond du Lac has great employee benefits, and his mom took him to get counseling regularly. Eventually, they reached the maximum. So she came and said, "What do I do, Karen?" Picked up the phone myself, called the county, and said, "This family needs help. We have woefully underfunded all mental health services, let alone children's mental health services." And the response that they gave her is, "We can only help you if you're on Medicaid. You'll have to quit your job to get your son continuing psychotherapy." Impoverish a family and add the stressors of that to everything that they've been through? That's cruel, right? So our clinic tried to do as much as they can, but over time, without the intervention that was necessary, he acted out. I think he vandalized a desk or something like that at school, right? He was acting out. Not big, not violent, just acting out. The school, of course, called the police. He got a damage to property. Then he was truant. After that, well, now he's violated probation. Pretty soon, a kid who needs mental health service is a criminal. And pretty soon he's 17 and still not committing violent acts, but now he can be charged as an adult. He's in the system now. He's a parent now. Wouldn't it have been a lot cheaper just to give him a counselor? Wouldn't it have been better for him? Wouldn't it have been better for his new baby and his partner? So Tawahe and Tawahe, Generation Indigenous, and some of these other programs that we're trying to do cross-agency through block granting are really about tribes identifying kids like that and what are the gaps, what is most needed in your community, and how do we fit those pieces in. Strengthening tribal courts has been huge. Violence Against Women Act recognized the violence against Indigenous women. The Tribal Law and Order Act put increasing resources into tribal communities and helped close some of the jurisdictional gaps where offenders, particularly those who take advantage of the fact that orders for protection weren't enforceable on tribal lands, they gave jurisdiction to tribal courts to close some of those loopholes. I would say one of the most significant things out of this administration was the Affordable Care Act. For everybody, right? So one of the things that the Indian Health Service is funded in 10-year increments. Up until this point, it was never reauthorized in the 10-year period. So they would have to go continuing resolution for 2 years, 6 years, just forever, right? And no funding increases, obviously, during that time. Before Obama came in, the Bemidji Area Indian Health Service, of which tribes around here are a part of, they would tell you themselves that Indian Health was funded at about 36% of defined need. 36% of need, not 36% of not met need, of need. So Obama put some serious cash into that, got it up to about 48% of defined need, and then the kicker, the Affordable Care Act. It permanently reauthorized funding for the Indian Health Service. Didn't need to come back begging every 10 years to Congress, only to be forgotten about. The other thing that was enormously impactful for tribes was the state exchanges. During my time there, Indian Health Service came up with a memoranda with HHS where Indian Health Service would reimburse states for the cost of tribal people in the exchanges, making it more likely that states with large Native populations would choose to expand Medicaid. Yay. You guys are so good. Every time I say yay, good job, good job. Obviously, I don't need to tell you, you heard from my bio that I thought the climate resiliency work was a good job. This president recognized that environmental justice is a real issue and that indigenous communities are at increased adverse risk to climate change, both in terms of their homelands, their access to treaty resources. Half of the tribes are in Alaska. We have 4 tribes in Alaska right now that are one storm surge away from losing their villages. Melting permafrost is causing aquifers to leach and saltwater incursion. They're losing their fresh water supplies. Caribou is changing their migration patterns. So in a village of 30, that's a fly-in village, if a caribou pattern changes, it means your grocery store walked away. There's no plan B. There's no plan B. They lose their who keeps doing that? Are you related to me? Maybe, right? So anyway, climate resiliency efforts, the ability to tribes to work directly with FEMA on when things do occur and to decide how to rebuild with resilience, to Department of Interior doing cooperative management agreements on federal lands where tribes have treaty and cultural interests, taking into account their traditional ecological knowledge and how they use those resources. It was a really smart deal to say, maybe we should do this together. You might have more experience at it. Tribes were starting to be an equal player at the table around landscape scale conservation issues, and we're being recognized for bringing the wealth and generational knowledge to the table that could actually help inform good management practices. That's good stuff too. Leasing of tribal lands. I told you that the federal government would hold land into trust on our behalf. That was unwieldy, and it was also untrustworthy. Their records weren't that great, really. You surprised by that? The Hearth Act was implemented, which puts tribal controls of leasing of their own lands back in tribal hands. So in other words, government to government, based on trust, building tribal capabilities, and continuing to work on that government to government. Obama also formally announced the U.S. support for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I do not need to tell you that in this day and age, having perhaps some international venue to air grievances is a small comfort at this time. But notions like free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people for issues that affect their homelands, protection of sacred sites, all of those issues that really just make us decent human beings, but we have to codify them to keep reminding people. The UN DRIP, the tribes have been asking for that for quite a long time, and having that endorsement was actually incredibly important to tribes. So then the world changed, and everything became different. And the speech I would have given you 60 days ago was actually would have ended right where I was, right there on the UN DRIP. And then everything changed. So what the heck do you do after Election Day when you're a special assistant to the president on Native American affairs, and the money is not, pretty much everybody's saying that you won't be replaced, which I haven't been, but which hope springs eternal. Which I will be disappointed in. So we have committed federal staff. Two of the things that the president did were the White House, he created the White House Council on Native American Affairs. And that's made up of cabinet level secretaries. It is always chaired by the Secretary of the Interior and includes the 27 agencies who have a portfolio in Indian country. That committee is staffed by career staff in the agencies. There was a mix of political staff supporting the secretaries, pardon me. We made sure in the last 14 months that all of the political appointees that were assisting their secretaries were partnered with career level staff. That would not change with the changing of administration. Now you got to remember, I'm Native, I'm cynical, it doesn't matter who got elected, right? I was a little bit cynical no matter who would have got it, really. So, I mean, Barack Obama, that was a big part of, that was the best we ever did. I was under no illusion. I was under no illusion that that would continue at that level. It was really up to both tribal leaders on the ground, committed Native staff, and advocates within the agencies to continue to demand that level of respectful government-to-government relationship, to follow the EO on consultation. So we made sure that there was career staff involved that wouldn't change with administrations. We identified all of those career staff to tribes before we left. Multi-year work plans were developed by each of the working subgroups of the White House Council, and career staff was involved in all of that. So there are contacts within the federal bureaucracy that remain committed, were committed and remain committed to Indian country. Well, don't get too excited. Big hearts and well intentions don't cut it, right? It's a good start. None of the rest happens without that, right? Right now we're looking at least 15% cuts in discretionary spending for 2017. This fiscal year. The president gets to finish out this year. The sitting president only does a budget for the beginning of the year. The incoming president rounds it out. They're already talking about withdrawing some 2-year funding because it's sitting in accounts waiting for the second year. They're getting some word that that's going to be considered surplus and taken back. So money is being put out the door for second-year funding as fast as they can so that stakeholders, not just tribes, everyone, gets their second-year funding in hand before they retract that funding. They're talking about even more in 2018. The Affordable Care Act, God, did we sweat that one out? That would be devastating, not just for Indian country, but for everybody pretty much middle income and down, you know? Everybody who has to take meds that might not be generic yet, or who has chronic conditions. Every American deserves the safety net of knowing that they can give the health care that they deserve. Indian Health Service wasn't even mentioned in the new bill. It just would have gone away, and all of its money with it. So if that rears its ugly head again, you all signed up for email, right? Yeah, yes. I might be in touch. That's what it's going to take, right? You ask me about the state of Native nations, and I will say, if we're left alone, we're doing pretty good. Give us the resources we need that the federal government should have or would have spent giving us the poor quality of care they gave us in so many ways. Support our self-determination, support our sovereignty, because that's what works on the ground. There isn't a study about what works in Indian country that doesn't say supporting tribal governments and tribal citizens to be self-determined and determining their priorities, strengthening their language and their access to culture and their identity after it being under attack for 250 years, helping them keep their children in their homes and wellness, and managing chronic conditions. If we could do those things, sky's the limit for Indian country. A brief word about sovereignty and Trump. He has been on the record. Yeah, that guy. I'm sorry, that was disrespectful. President Trump. I'm not real good at that. I apologize. He has been on record saying that he doesn't understand why tribes get bothered with. He has been on record saying racist things about how he thinks tribes should look and to behave, and he doesn't understand why tribes are involved in economic development activities. Well, we're involved in economic development activities because despite the fact that we're governments, we've never gotten taxing authority. I'm not saying we want it. I'm just saying that every other government has an ability to fund themselves and have established mechanisms. The only mechanisms we have for tribes are two. Wait for the federal government to give it to us, which hasn't worked out so well, or run businesses where we get to earn it. Right? Right. Yeah. That's funny. Okay. Anyway, so support tribal sovereignty, support self-determination, understand that what works for tribal communities, a rising tide truly does lift all boats. When tribal communities do well, we're not in out-of-home placement, we're not in incarceration, we're not in detox facilities, we are healthy, just like our neighbors are. We're slowly breaking those cycles of historical trauma. And we would like to continue to be leaders around preserving our homelands. We are doing a terrible job of taking care of our planet. There is not a greater thing. None of the rest of it matters if we can't breathe our air or drink our water. And I heard money doesn't make a very good appetizer. Right? So there are some things that are more important. And so With that, I am happy to take questions from all of you. Thank you.
I'm going to get you some more water. Thank you so much. And now, please step forward, and we've got time for Q&A. And I promised Karen that there would be really good questions coming. So please step forward.
Oh, come on, you were whooping and hollering. Somebody's got something. There we go.
Good evening.
Hi.
I'm wondering what your proper title is and what you're going to be doing next.
What my proper title is?
Yes. Are you still chairwoman?
I am not. I resigned that to go to Washington. I'm
Right,
just
but-
Karen.
Just Karen.
I was actually just Karen before, but depending on the attitude on the people on the other side of the table. Then I became chairwoman. I don't know what I'm doing next. I'm doing a little teaching now at UMD. I'm enjoying being with my family. I went to DC by myself and left my husband behind and my parents, so I need to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. Why, you got ideas? Yes.
Hi. I'm just wondering what your opinion about the Dakota Access Pipeline is,
Ah,
if you'd like to share.
no, who would have thought that would have came up?
Who would have thought?
Well, I will say a few things, and then there are some things I cannot talk about. I continue to be unable to talk about any of the internal deliberative processes of the White House, but I will tell you about a couple things that I find curious. Okay?
Cool. Thank you.
My first day on the job, I got handed a 6-page memo that talked about what the relationship of the executive office of the president is with agencies. And the White House is not supposed to be a bully pulpit. Secretaries run agencies. Congress tasks them with being regulatory agencies and outlines what the scope of that authority is. So in other words, what they were telling me was, people in the White House don't call up the IRS and say, you should audit that guy. We don't call up Department of Justice and say, you should investigate that person. And we don't call up Army Corps and tell them when they should issue permits or not. But what the Executive Office of the President can do, though, is work with agencies on prioritizing regulatory change. And regulatory change happens in a really transparent way, right? For tribes, for one, it should happen in consultation with tribes because of that executive order. But they're also published in the Federal Register. Citizens know what's going on and get a chance to participate and comment on proposed regulations, right? So then we come to Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock. Full disclosure, I consider Chairman Dave Archambault a friend, as well as his sister Jody Gillette, who was my predecessor at the White House as a special assistant to the president, and I was certainly aware of what was going on with Dakota Access Pipeline. I think that it is a marvel of social media and masterful that so many allies became aware of what ceded territories are and of tribal rights. I think that the agencies that were involved could have done a better job, which is why we kept convening them and came up with a document right before I left called Tribal Recommendations for Improving Infrastructure Projects on or Near Tribal Lands. I think that North Dakota has behaved horribly. One of the questions I got asked from folks was, why didn't DOJ go in there? They went to Ferguson. DOJ can offer. You heard the president say he was going to send federal officers into Chicago, and everybody went apeshit. That's a technical term. Right? You remember that? You don't federalize local policing. DOJ can offer, and in Ferguson's case, they accepted. North Dakota declined. So that mess that went down, they can own that in that state. They made those decisions, and it was atrocious, atrocious and horrible. I think the litigation will go on for an awful long time. And you asked me what I think about DAPL in particular. I think that each tribe is going to make that decision for themselves. My tribe faced a pipeline decision. It was either going to go through an existing right-of-way that had been there for 60 years, or it was going to go south of us through Peat Bog, which connected by aquifer to our wild rice lakes. I think that sometimes decisions aren't always a win-win. I think sometimes if you're a leader and you're not sitting in the cheap seats being critical from the outside, that sometimes the best you can hope for is less of a lose, and that you mitigate risk, right? I am angry that there are so many people who feel like they are allies to tribes that have co-opted Standing Rock's message. It was never about climate change in the beginning. It was about safe drinking water. And a lot of allies came in and turned it into climate change and turned it into so many other issues for their own benefit, whether it was their own nonprofit or their own sense of worth. We don't need allies that appropriate our mission and our cause and our sovereignty. That if you are going to be an ally to Indian country, the only message that you repeat is the one coming out of Standing Rock by its legitimate leaders. And if you can't do that, then you're doing more harm than good because you're undermining their sovereignty. Okay.
Karen, thank you for your wisdom. I'd like to change the topic completely.
Okay.
Moose research by Fond du Lac. Mr. Strange is in charge, I believe. The governor actually had to tell the DNR and Fond du Lac to stop testing and zeroing in on moose for capture and testing because moose are declining so hugely. Why is the DNR and Fond du Lac so out of touch with the fact that moose are dying from climate change and continue to try and get resources to study the issue when it's obvious? And we should let this icon moose go out with some dignity. Thank you.
Okay, well, the current chairman's name is Kevin Dupy. I'm not sure what they've been up to in the last 14 months. Collaring was important at a certain time because we did need to find out. I'll tell you this much. We're supposed to be co-managers. A lot of those decisions are actually made by the state, whether we agree with them or not. Collaring was happening. Fond du Lac has a moose biologist, a wildlife biologist. He's worked for Fond du Lac for over 20 years, very skilled in his field. Climate change is a part of it. Some of it is also some of our management practices. And how we handle forestry, how we handled the blowdown and growth. But there's a huge water. Water's an issue in drought. Pathways, wildlife corridors and things like that. I'm not going to say I agree with you or I disagree with you. It's probably half and half. But this is a precious resource to the Fond du Lac Band. Whether I think you agree with us or not, I have to respect as a citizen their intentions of taking care of one of their most important cultural resources as well as subsistence resources. We argue quite frequently with the state around wildlife management as well as fishery management. I know there's more than one fish biologist. I'm going to veer off a little bit since you opened that door. Around Lake Mille Lacs, there's one biologist in particular that loves to blame the bands for netting on Mille Lacs, even though for the last about 12 years, bands have been telling the state that there's too much fishing of certain classes of fish. The bands offered to change the net sizes, the holes in the nets, so we could go after a different class, larger fish, and get rid of some of the predators, and the state fought us. And then they introduced muskie, which is a predator fish, right? So now you're left with a ton of, just voracious eaters, and then the fry don't grow. So we need to put more of the in co-management, frankly, because those need to be shared decisions. I will say this, there's never been a fish taken out of Mille Lacs that tribes haven't counted. We can't say the same for sport anglers. So if you're going to hold anybody accountable, then you hold us to the same standards of gathering, and then we'll figure it out from there, right? But you have to have the same standard across. But those are our treaty rights. Don't have to agree with them. And the moose population was pretty stable in the last 2 years, too. Not growing, but stable. Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out sort of an obvious, well, it's not so obvious, but an obvious thing, that all this oppression, Indian policy, and whatnot is government programs. Segregation, slavery, Jim Crow laws. These are all government programs, and a lot of people want to solve those solutions with more government programs. And I know we got to work within the system too, but it's just something people don't think about. That same government, we're asking them to provide the solution to all the destruction they created coming up through the years. And I also feel like we're all, the general population, the way things are moving, it's in the direction that we're all going to be on a reservation of some sort. I'll let you think about that, people. But I don't think anybody's getting freer.
I think the doorway off of that, though, is going to be easier for some than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just saying.
I understand.
All right.
But so my question is, I'm really interested in just as far as Fond du Lac here, how everything's going. A lot of programs.
I'm not in charge anymore.
Well, I figure you had your finger on the pulse a little bit, but
who said that?
Well, even I'm done. You got me. It's,
I'm a proud citizen of the Fond du Lac Band. I have no desire to run for elected office again.
There's been huge changes in your time, even in your time as chairwoman and whatnot.
For type A personalities, you got to learn to get some boundaries, right? So that whole not my circus, not my monkeys kind of thing.
Fair enough.
So I need to tell you about governing an Indian country. I mean, you got to remember that I'm related to most of those folks. If I pissed off my citizens, that was my aunties. That's a hard place to be in for 9 years, almost
You're
9
accountable,
years.
Yes. Nowhere
like
to
my
run.
cousin over there. He probably started that icky Facebook page.
No shouts from that side. Well, the question being, well.
What's your question?
I was just being polite, but I'm just wondering, how do you feel personally how it's going, saving the old ways culturally and whatnot? Not too far back, nobody was very far removed, and it's just been a worry of mine, just obviously that dissipating over the generations. And I have seen, a couple real good things, younger people in the tribe that are really doing a good job of saving the old ways and passing it on to younger people. And I was just wondering if you thought it was going pretty well and where you thought it was at.
I think we are resilient and dynamic people. I think that our oral traditions inform us. I think that Old ways sometimes adapt and become new. Our language will stay the same. There was a concerted effort for 200 years to strip us of our identity, whether it was taking our children and shipping them off to boarding school, or they got beat for speaking the language, or the fostering system, you know, an oppressive K-12 system, et cetera, et cetera. People did what they needed to do to survive, and there's lots of different looking, legitimately native scenarios. We have a generation back, the Indian relocation program, where they told people, we'll help you find a job if you move to a major urban area. It was an attempt to assimilate Indians into cities. You have some of the citizens of our communities who's never stepped foot on their reservation, and their identity solely comes from within their own family. Whether we like it or not, or whether it looks like Dances with Wolves or not, that is still legitimately a Native American experience. And it is not for anybody's judgment, because you want to know why? At least they're alive. A lot of them aren't, right? So I had a conversation with a band member once who was busting my chops because I'm not fluent in the language. And it's something I would like someday. It's very difficult. It's time consuming. It's a commitment. And I was running the res. Had a little bit going on, right? You know, a part of what we came to in our conversation is I told him, I know how to read a financial statement. Right now, there is less of me in the band than there are language speakers. In other words, we all have our gifts, and our tribes need every single one of them.
So Governor Dayton signed an executive order a couple years back requiring that state-level agencies. Oh, for sure. Governor Dayton passed a executive order a couple years back that required state agencies that have dealings in Indian country to consult with tribes, similar to the Clinton one, and also to go through tribal relations trainings. But what more can be done at a state level, since the outlook for the federal level looks so not awesome right now, to put it lightly? What role to kind of get around that? Or because I think that at the state level there is that support of wanting to do something. At least that's what I get from having an executive order like that. And so what else can be done?
You know, I hate to be cynical on you, hon, but you can't order people to not have bias in them, right? So it really is individual. I mean, I see some commissioners who, without the governor telling them anything, recognized that there was something that needed to be done and that there was some moral imperative, and then worked to do it. You know, I had interactions with the DNR commissioner that, to me, were more akin to Jim Crow South. You know, he was under the same executive order. So it really depends. You can't legislate that. Nor could you at the federal level. I guess the biggest thing that I have to say to all of their jurisdictions is the quirky way that tribal governance works is the people of Fond du Lac are my citizens, but you wouldn't necessarily be my citizen, right? You might be some other kind of stakeholder, like an employee or a spouse or something like that, right? One of our extended family members. But when you look at other jurisdictions in Minnesota, my citizens, my fellow citizens at Fond du Lac are absolutely citizens of those other jurisdictions. We share them. So probably the scariest part for me is when I hear, well, you people, or you need to. No, let's talk about us and we, because we share these folks, and you have an absolute obligation. These are citizens of Minnesota, they are citizens of counties, they are citizens of school districts or townships, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that investment in training and really looking at the tribal relations training that's been done through UMD is a good investment in the long term. Frankly, it's the reason I do things like this. It's a lot easier to get people in a group than one by one, frankly. But I'll do it one by one if we need to, because building the understanding that tribal sovereignty doesn't need to be threatening, and our own self-determination doesn't need to be threatening, and sometimes you're not going to agree with us, but you don't get to diminish our ability to make those decisions for ourselves because maybe you're not entitled to that opinion about how we govern ourselves. Those are conversations that need to be had, but they happen in a vacuum, and that makes it fearful. So I think continuing to build the relationship and remove the scariness of it is a good thing. And I think times will change partly because of young people. You know? Yeah.
I'll ask it fast.
I don't answer fast.
It
sorry.
runs the risk of being redundant, but I walked all the way down from the top. So one of the things I think is really special about living here is that there are off-reservation ceded territory rights.
You need to say that over
That
again.
there's off-reservation rights. There's ceded territory rights to hunt, fish, and gather and practice traditional ways in the upper Midwest. And I was just wondering if you have any insight on what you think might be the biggest challenges for off-reservation rights. You know, it happens in the state of Washington and up in the Northwest too, but here that we might be facing or that you've dealt with in the past or observed in the past.
The biggest threat, so did all of you hear, should I repeat that? About ceded territory. So here's the reservation, but in the treaty we said we retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather in this area. And so those ceded territory rights are the reason why, you know, tribes have bigger jurisdiction over a lot of wildlife issues and habitat issues. And she asked me what I think the biggest threat is. I think the biggest threat is economic. With growing economic inequality in this country and between rural and other parts of the state, the quest for the perception of jobs and access to wealth happens almost in a vacuum. And I think that's poor public policy. Getting somebody a job for 20 years isn't going to do them any good if they can't drink their water when it's done. It would be cheaper at that point. I mean, 500 years of water treatment or more, it would be cheaper to pay 200 people to stay home for the next 20 years than it would be to clean up the mess from copper nickel mining. So I definitely think that that's pandering. It's pandering to people's fears. It's pandering to their reality of income insecurity, economic instability. And rather than looking for real, meaningful, sustainable answers, they're going for the quick fix. But they're not balancing the scales with all of the considerations that should be taken. And that's just wrong. And I'll tell that to whoever you tell me to. All right, thank you all.
We have to end now because she drank all the water. But Ms. Diver, and I will go out in the lobby, and you don't have to talk to me, you can talk to her. She said she'll stay here for a little while longer and we can continue this conversation. Thank you all very much for coming. See you next fall.